Okay, so in the last video, we ended here at the function of bone, even though we talked a little bit about it. So what does bone do for us? It gives us shape, support, protection. It's a, what your face looks like is primarily because of the shape of the bones of your facial bones of your skull. The cranium protects the brain. The ribs protect the lungs, etc., etc. They act as the levers for movement. It's what the muscles attach to. So they're integral to movement. Blood cell formation happens primarily in the red bone marrow. We will talk about this in the circulatory system. It becomes the storage place for most of the minerals, especially calcium. It's very important. Calcium is an important electrolyte for a lot of different things in physiology, and the concentrations are very, very tightly maintained, basically by two hormones. One comes from the thyroid, it's calcitonin, and the other comes from the parathyroid glands called parathyroid hormone. So bone is the reservoir for calcium. When blood calcium levels are low, we release parathyroid hormone, which make osteoclasts eat more bone, and therefore exocytose, they shed more calcium, and blood calcium levels go up. When blood calcium levels are too high, calcitonin inhibits osteoclasts and stimulates depositing calcium into the matrix of the bone. Calcitonin puts calcium in the bone. And the same thing goes for magnesium, potassium, carbonate, various other things. So we really follow the calcium levels. Okay, the skeleton itself. Now, I'm not going to make it so that you have to memorize all the bones in the body, but at least not all of the skull bones, not necessarily all of the carpal bones and the tarsal bones. There's two major organization parts of the skeleton. There's the axial skeleton, which is around your center, and the appendicular skeleton, which are your upper and lower limbs. So the axial skeleton is the skull, hyoid, vertebral column, ribs, and sternum. Appendicular is from the clavicle and the shoulder blade through your upper limb, the hip bones, and your lower limb. In the kind of the red color is the axial skeleton, in the yellowy color is the appendicular. Now, this is reasonably arbitrary. Like, the clavicle ends up being appendicular, but it's the place where the upper limb articulates with the axial. The sacrum is axial. The hip bones are appendicular, but together the three of them form the pelvic girdle. So again, this is not, it's useful for discussing it, but it's reasonably arbitrary. when we look at the number of bones in the body, there's 206. I know some profs here at Georgian that would say there are 206 bones in the body, and by the end of this, you will know all of them, and you will, know the names of every bump and blah blah blah. And they try and scare people. Really, there's 206 bones in the body, but you can see 24 of them are named rib, right? There's 60 bones in the upper limbs and 60 bones in the lower limbs, but there's 28 phalanges in each one. So really 56 of them are named phalange. And there's freaking 2 of just about everything else. 24 of them are named vertebrae. A sacrum and a coccyx. So really, there's not that many names to learn. I'm not going to worry about any of the skeletal structures. So, in the skull, we have 8 bones that are cranial bones, 14 bones that are facial bones, and 3 bones in the middle ear. We'll talk about sutures when we talk about joints. Basically, the cranium and the cranial bones, those 8 bones surround the brain. If the bone comes into contact with the brain, it's considered a cranial bone. So the sphenoid and the ethmoid bone, which are both important parts of the face, are still considered cranial bones. 14 bones in the skull don't touch the brain, and so they are considered the facial bones. A lot of the bones are hollow, so that they have these areas called sinuses for lower weight. In the cranium, we have the frontal bone, which is the forehead from the orbits of the eyes back to the suture that with the parietal bones. The parietal bones are on either side. There's 2 of them, and they form the roof of the skull. So this is the frontal bone, and we're going to see that in every one of the pictures, the frontal bone will be this color. The parietal bones will be this blue color. The nasal bones will be this teal color. The sphenoid bone will be this lavender, purple color. The zygomatic will always be green, etc. So that you can see these from different angles. These are all the cranial bones. This is the frontal bone from here to here. The parietal bones will be here. The occipital bone comes all the way here. Right? The temporal bone is here. This part is the sphenoid bone, and this is the ethmoid bone. So the occipital bone is the back of the skull, all the way to articulating with the first vertebrae. The temporal bones are in your temples. This is where your lower jaw articulates. There's a big bump called the mastoid process and the styloid process, etc. The sphenoid and the ethmoid. We're not going to go crazy into listing these. Just be aware of the names. In the facial bone, there are 13 bones that don't move, they have sutures, and 1 bone that does. So the maxilla is the upper jaw, the floor of the orbits. The palatine bones form the roof of the mouth, the palate. Zygomatic bones are your cheekbones. Lacrimal bones are, lacrima is tears, so it's the inside of the orbit, kind of where your tear ducts are. Nasal bones are the bridge of the nose. The vomer bone is the nasal septum. It's the thing that separates your two nostrils. The conchae swirl air around. The mandible is the lower jaw bone, and it's the one that moves. So if we look at it, this yellow one is the temporal bone. The lacrimal bone is here. Zygomatic is here. All of this red is the temporal bone, where the ear is, where the TMJ is, articulating with the zygomatic, so part of the cheekbone. Mandible is here. The ones that I'm expecting you to be able to identify are the mandible, the maxilla, the frontal, the parietal, occipital, temporal bone, and zygomatic. Some of these little bones get to be harder to point out on a diagram. If we look underneath, there's the vomer bone. All of this is the sphenoid bone. Interesting, the occipital bone, which people think at the back of their skull, goes all the way right here to basically the top of your throat. Inside it looks like this. This is the temporal bone, and this is where the inner ear is. A sagittal view. This is all the sphenoid bone. The ethmoid bone is this bone here. Frontal, parietal, occipital. Okay. In the vertebral column, there are 24 vertebrae plus the sacrum and the coccyx. Now, all the way from the skull to the bottom of your bum, there's all kinds of ligaments. There are fibrocartilaginous discs between each of the vertebrae that act as spacers and shock absorbers. There is a kind of a typical structure of the typical vertebrae. There's a body, pedicles, lamina, spinous process, foramen. Foramen means hole. Transverse processes that stick out. Articular processes that form joints. But it's like this. The first 7 here are the cervical vertebrae. The next 12 have ribs. They're the thoracic vertebrae. 5 lumbar vertebrae, big triangular sacrum, and the coccyx. I am expecting you to know the numbers. 7, 12, 5, 1, and 1. Kind of an S-shaped curve here. The cervical vertebrae, the first 7, the curve is concave forward. The thoracic is convex, and the 5 lumbars are concave, the sacrum is convex. So we have this very typical thing. Thoracic have ribs attached. I said that, I think. All mammals have 7 cervical vertebrae. Giraffes have 7 cervical vertebrae. Humans do. 2 to 6 are typical vertebrae, but the first 2 have special names and there's special shapes. The first vertebrae is called the atlas, and it articulates with condyles, with joints on the occipital bone of the skull, and it basically supports the head. The second vertebrae is called the axis, and it has a projection called the dens, the odontoid process, that pivots with the axis. So the atlas in the skull lets you say yes, nod your head that way. The atlas and axis articulate, letting you say no with rotation. So this is a typical cervical vertebrae, so this one looks like it's about number 4. All of them have got a small spinous process, big articular processes, a hole in the transverse process here, and kind of this block-shaped body, and a big triangular hole where the the spinal cord runs. Atlas and axis are special. You'll notice there's no body in C1, the atlas, right? This is the front, this is the back, so very little spinous process. Still a hole in the transverse foramen. Big articular processes. Now this sits down over the top of this, the odontoid process. Looks more like a typical vertebrae with this thing sticking up. And that sticks up right in there and allows the pivot that this thing rotates on. The thoracic vertebrae all have ribs attached to them. There's 12 of them. They tend to look like this. The body is heart-shaped. I've got little joints where the ribs attach. The transverse processes are long for levers, and the spinous process is long as well. The hole is a little bit smaller and almost perfectly round. The 5 lumbar vertebrae support the weight of the body, so they're big. They look like this. Great big body that tends to be kind of bean-shaped, larger than the rest of the vertebrae put together. The vertebral foramen is reasonably small and triangular. Short, stubby transverse processes and short, stubby spinous processes with big articular processes here. This part's called the lamina. These are the pedicles, as in pedestal. The sacrum really starts out fetally as 5 vertebrae, but they fuse together. And the coccyx, which is the tailbone, is 4 little vertebrae that end up getting fused together, and they end up just being 1 bone each. So if we look at the sacrum, you can see how they look almost like fused together 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 vertebrae that look almost like lumbar vertebrae. Just the transverse processes have fused to each other here. The disc is gone and it's fused here. This is the coccyx, tends to be 4 little rudimentary ones. The thoracic cage really is the ribs and the sternum and the costal cartilages. There's 12 pairs of ribs. 7 ribs go from the thoracic vertebrae all the way to the sternum. They're called the true ribs. The other 5 are called false ribs. 3 of them join onto the cartilage of number 7. So sometimes those are called costochondral. And the bottom 2 don't attach to the sternum at all, so they're called the floating ribs. There's a shaft, head, and tubercle. We'll see a picture in a minute. The sternum is the breastbone. It's the midline of the thoracic cage in the front. The top part is called the manubrium, the middle is the body, and the lower part is the xiphoid process. So it looks like this. This is the manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid. In some people, the xiphoid never turns into bone. These are the costal cartilages. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 are true ribs. 8, 9, and 10 join onto costal cartilage 7 here, and the floating ribs 11 and 12 are down here. Vertebrochondral, vertebrosternal. We'll stop here and we'll pick up at the appendicular skeleton in a moment. Next video.